There is a training evolution in the United States Navy that has broken some of the toughest people who ever put on a uniform. Not broken in spirit, not broken in heart, but physically overwhelmed, disoriented, and helpless in a way that no amount of mental toughness can fully prepare you for. It happens underwater, in the dark, upside down, and with no way to know which direction is up. It is called underwater egress training, and the specific evolution most people have never heard of is the Dilbert Dunker. But that is just the beginning, because the Navy does not stop there. It goes further, deeper, and harder, with a program called Hewitt, the Helicopter Underwater Escape Trainer, and for certain communities, it pushes even further into one of the most psychologically demanding underwater survival courses on the planet. Most candidates who attempt the full progression of Navy underwater escape training do not walk away unchanged. Many do not complete it at all. Today we are going inside the water. We are going to talk about exactly what happens, exactly why it exists, exactly what it demands from the human body and mind, and exactly what kind of person makes it through to the other side. If you respect the men and women who go through hell so that they can bring their crews home alive, type survivor in the comments right now. Before we get into this, please take a second to hit that subscribe button. Over 98% of people watching this video are not subscribed. It costs you nothing, and it means everything. Now let us get into it. To understand why this training exists, you first have to understand the environment it prepares people for. The ocean is not a forgiving place. It does not care about your rank. It does not care about how long you trained. It does not care about your family back home or the fact that you have been serving your country for a decade. The ocean operates on physics, and when a Navy aircraft goes down in the water, or when a helicopter ditches during a search and rescue mission, or when a surface vessel takes on water faster than anyone expected, physics takes over. And physics in that moment looks like this. The aircraft inverts. It fills with water in seconds. The cockpit becomes a sealed metal coffin spinning in every direction at once. Visibility drops to zero. The exit that was right in front of you 60 seconds ago is now somewhere behind you, above you, or blocked entirely. Your body, operating on pure adrenaline and pure panic, wants to do exactly the wrong things. It wants to push when it should pull. It wants to move fast when it should move slow. It wants to gasp for air when there is none to be had. And it wants to find the surface by instinct, when instinct in an inverted, flooded aircraft will take you directly into the fuselage and drown you. That is what this training is designed to defeat. Not the ocean itself, but the body's own catastrophic response to being trapped in it. The history of why this training exists is written in tragedy. In the early decades of naval aviation, crash survivability in water was almost entirely a matter of luck. Pilots who survived the crash itself frequently drowned in aircraft that they could not escape in time. The equipment worked, the aircraft could have been exited, but the crew did not know how. They panicked. They made the wrong moves. They ran out of air 6 feet from an open hatch because the disorientation of an inverted aircraft convinced them they were moving toward the surface when they were moving deeper. The Navy looked at those losses and made a decision. The ocean would not take sailors because of a lack of training. Whatever it cost, whatever it demanded, the men and women who flew and crewed naval aircraft would be taught to survive underwater egress under the most realistic conditions a training environment could create. And that is how the Dilbert Dunker was born. The Dilbert Dunker. Even the name carries weight among the people who have been through it. The device itself looks almost absurdly simple. It is essentially a cockpit mock-up mounted on a track above a deep pool. The trainee straps in, just like they would in a real aircraft. They grip the handles, they lock their posture, and the Dunker slides down the track and hits the water. But here is where it stops being simple. The Dunker does not stop at the surface. It goes under, and then it inverts. Within 2 to 3 seconds of hitting the water, the trainee is underwater, upside down, fully submerged, still strapped into their seat. The cockpit fills with water. Everything the body thought it knew about up and down is now wrong. Everything the mind was telling the trainee about which way to move is now wrong. And the clock is ticking, because the air that was in their lungs when this started is not unlimited. The procedure for escaping the Dilbert Dunker is precise and deliberate. Wait for the motion to stop. This is the first and most counterintuitive instruction. The natural human response when something is going wrong is to move immediately, to fight, to act. But in an inverted aircraft, moving before the motion stops means moving in the wrong direction. It means wasting precious seconds pushing against a door that will not open until pressure equalizes. It means burning through lung capacity before you even start the real work. So the procedure says wait. Let the dunker finish inverting. Let the motion stop. Feel the world go still, even upside down in a flooded cockpit. Then and only then do you begin. You locate the exit by feel, not by sight. You do not look for the exit because there is nothing to see. You run your hands along the frame, find the handle, and you execute the precise sequence you practiced on dry land. A sequence you burned into muscle memory so deep that panic cannot overwrite it. You push out, you follow your bubbles to the surface, because bubbles do not lie about which way is up, and you get out. That sounds manageable when it is written in a paragraph. It is something else entirely when you are the one strapped in. The candidates who describe their first dunker run talk about the moment the world inverts. They talk about the way the water hits the face like a wall. They talk about the sudden complete loss of spatial awareness that no amount of watching videos or reading descriptions prepares you for. They talk about the moment where the trained part of the brain has to physically wrestle control away from the panicking part. And they talk about the silence underwater, which should be calming, but which in that context is one of the most terrifying things a human being can experience. Former Navy aircrew who went through this training consistently say the same thing. Nothing in their lives had ever put them in a situation where their own instincts were so completely, so entirely, so dangerously wrong. And surviving the Dilbert Dunker meant learning, at a bone-deep level, to stop listening to those instincts. But the Dilbert Dunker is not the end. It is the beginning. Because the Navy needed something that went further. Something that replicated not just the experience of a fixed-wing cockpit inversion, but the experience of what happens when a helicopter goes into the water. And if you think an aircraft cockpit inverting underwater sounds bad, you need to understand what a helicopter crash into water actually looks like. A helicopter does not glide into the ocean. It does not enter cleanly. A helicopter ditching into water is chaotic, violent, and almost always results in the aircraft rolling. Rotor blades hit the water, and the rotational forces they were generating, which kept the helicopter in the air, become rotational forces that spin the fuselage. The helicopter rolls, often rapidly, often multiple times. The cabin fills with water. Passengers and crew are thrown against whatever is in reach. The exits are moving, the world is spinning, and the water is cold, dark, and completely uninterested in whether you make it out. This is the scenario that the helicopter underwater escape trainer, the Hewitt, was designed to replicate. And where the Dilbert Dunker is intense, the Hewitt is something that the people who have been through it describe in a different register entirely. The Hewitt is a full-scale helicopter fuselage mock-up. It seats multiple trainees simultaneously. It is suspended above a deep training pool. When the exercise begins, the entire fuselage is dropped into the water and begins its roll. Trainees are strapped in, just as they would be in a real helicopter. The cabin fills with water as the fuselage inverts. And then the work begins. Every person in that fuselage has to execute their egress procedure correctly. They have to locate their exit. They have to operate their harness release. They have to push out through a window or a door. And they have to do it in complete coordination, because the exits are shared. If the person next to you panics and cannot get out, the exit they are blocking is the exit you need. The Hewitt does not just test individual performance. It tests human performance under the specific kind of pressure that breaks cooperation, breaks communication, and breaks the basic ability to think clearly, which is the pressure of drowning. Instructors who have overseen Hewitt training for years describe a consistent pattern. There is a category of candidate who walks in physically ready, strong swimmer, good athlete, solid performer in every other training evolution, and completely falls apart in the Hewitt. Not because they are weak, not because they are afraid, but because the combination of inversion, submersion, disorientation, and the primal certainty that the air in their lungs is running out triggers a physiological response that overrides everything they trained for. They freeze. They pull at the wrong handle. They push against the fuselage instead of the exit. They burn through their breath in the first 10 seconds and surface without completing the procedure, gasping and wide-eyed in a way that no amount of warrior spirit could have prevented. The Hewitt does not lie about people. It shows exactly what a person does when the most fundamental survival instinct they have, the need to breathe, is in direct conflict with the procedure that will actually save their life. The candidates who make it through describe a different experience. Not easier, but different. They described the moment in the water where the panic response arrived and they felt it, named it, and set it aside. Not suppressed it, not defeated it, but acknowledged it and continued working anyway. They described the specific sensation of operating a hatch release underwater while inverted and disoriented, with burning lungs and no visual reference points. They described the way the training forced a fundamental rewiring of how the brain processes danger, specifically the discovery that doing the right thing in a survival situation can feel exactly like doing the wrong thing, and that the only way through is to trust the procedure over the instinct every single time. One former Navy search and rescue swimmer described his Hewitt experience this way: "Everything in my body was screaming at me that I was dying, and the only thing that got me out was the knowledge that my body was wrong." You have to be able to tell yourself that your own body is lying to you, believe it, and keep moving anyway. That is the standard. That is what the Hewitt is testing. But even the Hewitt is not the end of the road. Because for certain communities within the Navy, particularly naval aircrew, who fly over open ocean, search and rescue personnel, SEAL candidates, and specific aviation designations, the training goes into a third phase that is widely considered the most psychologically demanding underwater survival evolution in the United States military. It is called the 9-line underwater egress, and variations of it are incorporated into programs like Combat Dive School and the SERE underwater component. But the Navy aviation version, conducted at facilities including the Naval Aerospace Medical Institute and Specialized Training Commands, takes the foundational lessons of the Dilbert Dunker and the Hewitt and adds the element that turns difficult into genuinely harrowing. Blackout goggles, the removal of every single visual reference point. Not dim lighting, not murky water, absolute zero visibility, complete and total darkness at the bottom of the pool, inverted, alone, with only your hands, and your training, and whatever is left of your composure after everything that came before. Consider what that means for a moment. In the Dilbert Dunker, there is some visual reference, light filtered through the water, the vague shape of the cockpit frame, enough to orient yourself even in the chaos of inversion. In the Hewitt, same thing. Disorienting, terrifying, but there is still some visual input reaching the brain. When you add the blackout goggles, you remove the last anchor point the brain had been using to maintain any sense of where it is in space. You are now navigating entirely by touch. The harness release that you have to hit is exactly where it always was. The window that you have to push out is exactly where it always was. The procedure is the same. But the body has lost the last piece of information it was quietly relying on to keep itself functional. And for many candidates, that is the breaking point. Instructors describe watching candidates complete the Dilbert Dunker clean, complete the Hewitt clean, look completely ready for whatever comes next, and then put on the blackout goggles and discover something about themselves that neither they nor their instructors expected. The complete darkness underwater, inverted, fills the space where visual information used to be, with something that does not have an easy name. Former candidates call it different things. Some call it the void. Some call it the noise. What they are describing is the experience of a brain that has been operating on a rational level and is now receiving no data, no light, no orientation, no reference, and which responds to that informational vacuum by generating its own. Fear without object, panic without cause. The overwhelming physical sensation of being completely, irreversibly lost in a space where there is no rescue and no way out. And the only thing standing between that sensation and a clean egress is the procedure burned into muscle memory before the water ever touched the trainee's face. The people who wash out at this stage are not weak. That point cannot be made strongly enough. The people who reach this stage of training are not beginners. They are not undertrained. They are some of the most physically and mentally prepared individuals in the United States Navy. They have already proven themselves in environments that the vast majority of Americans will never face. And they hit this wall and they cannot get through it, not on that attempt, not on that day, sometimes not ever. The blackout egress in zero visibility water does not give partial credit. You either execute the procedure correctly and exit the training apparatus under control, or you do not. And if you do not, you surface with the goggles still on, pulled by an instructor safety diver who was there watching the entire time, and you understand something about the limits of human performance in a way that no classroom and no lecture and no simulation on dry land could have taught you. The safety protocols surrounding this training are extensive. There are safety divers in the water throughout every evolution. There are medical personnel standing by above the surface. The training apparatus is designed to be exited by instructors immediately if a candidate is in genuine distress. No one has ever drowned in a properly run underwater egress training evolution, and the Navy intends to keep it that way. The point of this training is not to hurt people. The point is to find out exactly what a person does when everything goes wrong at once, when they are underwater and inverted and disoriented and running out of air, because that specific combination of conditions will not wait for a good day or a favorable moment if it ever occurs in the real world. The training has to be real enough to trigger the real response, because if it does not, if the trainee goes through a comfortable simulation and learns comfortable habits, those comfortable habits will kill them when the real thing hits. Let us talk about who goes through this training, because the answer is broader than most people realize. Naval aviators are the most commonly associated group, and with good reason. Every pilot and crew member who will fly over water in a Navy aircraft must be current on underwater egress training. That covers a staggering number of people. F-18 pilots, E-2 Hawkeye crews, P-8 Poseidon operators, helicopter crews across every naval aviation community, from the MH-60 Sierra, which does search and rescue, to the MH-60 Romeo, which hunts submarines, to every other rotary wing and fixed-wing platform that operates over water. But it does not stop there. Naval Special Warfare candidates, the men working their way toward the SEAL teams and Special Warfare Combatant Craft Crewman designation, go through versions of underwater egress training as part of a pipeline that is already the most demanding in the U.S. military. SERI specialists, the men and women who teach survival, evasion, resistance, and escape to other military personnel, go through extensive underwater training components. Navy divers and rescue swimmers, whose entire job involves operating in environments that would kill most people, face underwater egress challenges that go well beyond what standard aircrew face. What this means in practice is that on any given year, thousands of Navy personnel cycle through underwater egress training at facilities across the country. The primary training site most associated with this work is Naval Air Station Pensacola in Florida, home of the Naval Aerospace Medical Institute and the Aviation Survival Training Center, where the pools and the dunkers and the Hewitt equipment live in buildings that do not look remarkable from the outside, but which are, for the people who go through what happens inside them, among the most significant buildings they will ever enter. But training also occurs at additional fleet concentration areas, and mobile Hewitt units can deploy to meet units where they are, which means this training follows Navy aviation wherever it goes. The instructors who run this training occupy a specific and fascinating space in the Navy ecosystem. They are, almost without exception, people who went through the training themselves at a younger point in their careers and who understood the importance of what they experienced so deeply that they chose to come back and be the person on the other side of the glass, watching candidates go through the water and learning from what they see. They are trained not just in the technical mechanics of dunker operation and Hewitt operation, but in human performance under stress, in the specific behavioral signatures that distinguish a candidate who is working through difficulty from a candidate who is in genuine danger, in the art of providing enough pressure to make the training real without providing so much that it becomes harmful. It is by any measure a job that requires exceptional judgment, because the margin between a valuable training evolution and a dangerous one is managed entirely by the quality of the human beings running the program. Former instructors describe the most rewarding moments of that work as watching a candidate fail in evolution, understand what happened, correct it in their mind, and then get back in the water and execute it cleanly. Because that moment, the moment where someone takes a genuine failure and converts it into genuine mastery, is exactly what the training is designed to produce. Not performance on a good day, performance on the worst day possible, when the aircraft is going down and the water is coming in and everything the body wants to do is wrong. The candidate who learns that lesson in the pool will carry it for the rest of their career. It will live in their hands and in their muscle memory in a way that cannot be erased by time or fear or the shock of a real emergency. Let us talk about the physical reality of what the body goes through during these evolutions, because it is worth understanding in detail. When a person is submerged unexpectedly, the body triggers what is called the diving reflex, a set of involuntary physiological responses designed to conserve oxygen. Heart rate drops. Blood flow is redistributed away from the extremities and toward the core and the brain. The body is buying time, trying to make the oxygen it has last as long as possible. This response is automatic and it is powerful, but it is also incomplete, because at the same moment the diving reflex is trying to help, the amygdala, the part of the brain responsible for fear response, is doing something very different. It is triggering a full threat response, elevating cortisol, elevating adrenaline, preparing the body for fight or flight in an environment where neither fight nor flight is currently an option. The result of these two competing physiological responses operating simultaneously is a state that is extremely difficult to describe and even more difficult to manage from the inside. Candidates describe the sensation as being simultaneously hyper-alert and completely overwhelmed. Everything is loud in the mind, even though the water is silent. Every second feels both endless and instantaneous. The part of the brain that knows the procedure is there, it is present, it is trying to run the sequence, but it is competing with a much older and much louder part that is focused entirely on the single fact that air is not available. And the training, fundamentally, is about building the procedural pathways in the brain to a level of automaticity where they can run even while this competition is happening. Psychologists who study human performance under threat describe this as creating procedural islands in a sea of stress, reliable, automatic sequences of action that can execute without conscious direction, because conscious direction is often not available when it is most needed. The Navy understood this before the psychological research caught up with the operational reality. Long before the neuroscience of stress inoculation was well documented, naval training developers looked at the outcomes of underwater aircraft accidents and understood intuitively what the data would later confirm. The only thing that works in those conditions is a procedure so deeply embedded that it runs itself. You cannot think your way out of an inverted flooding cockpit. You have to have practiced your way out. And practice means the water. Practice means the dunker. Practice means the huette. Practice means, for the people who go all the way, the darkness and the void and the blackout goggles, and the moment where the only thing between you and a safety diver extraction is whether what you trained is real enough to run without you consciously driving it. Now let us talk about what the training demands outside the water. Because underwater egress training does not begin when the trainee hits the pool. It begins hours or days before, in classrooms and dry training environments where the procedures are taught, demonstrated, practiced, and internalized before a single drop of water is involved. The academic component of underwater egress training is extensive. Trainees learn the physics of what happens when an aircraft enters the water, specifically the hydrodynamic forces that cause inversion, the rate at which cabins flood under various impact conditions, the role of atmospheric pressure in door and hatch operation underwater, and the precise sequential steps required to execute a clean egress from every type of aircraft in their potential operational environment. They learn it in detail. They are tested on it. They are not permitted to move to the pool phase until the academic component is complete and demonstrated. Then comes dry training, where the cockpit or cabin mock-up is operated on the floor of the training facility without water involved. Trainees strap in, the mock-up is inverted manually, and they execute the procedure from start to finish in conditions that are uncomfortable but not immediately dangerous. They do this repeatedly. The goal is to make the procedure so familiar, so automatic, that the body can execute it without waiting for the mind to catch up. Instructors watch every repetition. They correct errors immediately and precisely. The hand that reached for the wrong handle first, the hesitation before harness release, the moment where the trainee looked for visual reference instead of using tactile cues. Every small error in dry training represents a potentially fatal error in water, and it is corrected now, before the stakes are real. Only after the academic component and the dry training component are complete does the trainee enter the pool, and they enter it incrementally. The first evolutions are conducted in daylight with clear water, with the procedure broken into individual components that are practiced separately before being assembled into the full sequence. This is not done to make things easy. It is done because research on skill acquisition under stress consistently shows that partial skill development is not just ineffective, it is dangerous. A trainee who has a vague and incomplete understanding of the procedure is worse off than a trainee who has never seen it at all, because the vague and incomplete version gives them false confidence while being unreliable when the conditions get hard. The Navy trains the whole procedure, trains it to standard, and then puts it under pressure to verify that the standard was actually achieved. The physical fitness standards associated with this training are significant. Trainees must be able to swim a qualifying distance in a qualifying time before they are permitted in the training pool. They must demonstrate water confidence and basic swimming competency. They must be medically cleared for the physical demands of the evolutions, which include breath-hold performance, cardiovascular response to cold water immersion, and the physical strength required to operate harness releases and hatch mechanisms while inverted and partially disoriented. For candidates whose water confidence is low, there are remedial swimming programs available before they enter the egress training pipeline. The Navy does not write people off because they are uncomfortable in water. It provides pathways to build the water competency that the training demands. But it does not lower the standard to accommodate discomfort. The standard exists because the ocean does not lower its standard. There is an element of this training that does not get discussed much outside of the community that has been through it, and that is the mental recovery process that follows the hardest evolutions. People who successfully complete the blackout Huet evolution, or the most demanding variations of multi-seat egress training in zero visibility, frequently describe a period in the hours and days afterward where the experience continues to process. Not in a clinical or traumatic sense, but in the way that any genuinely significant event continues to live in the mind after it is over. They replay it. They run through the moments where things were hardest. They sit with the knowledge of what their body did and did not do under that specific kind of pressure. And for most of them, that processing leads somewhere specific. It leads to a quality that is difficult to name precisely, but which experienced military personnel recognize immediately. It is the knowledge, not the belief, but the actual knowledge that you have been in a situation where the most primal part of your brain was telling you that you were going to die, and you worked through it anyway. That knowledge does not make people arrogant. People who have been through genuinely hard training rarely come out arrogant. What it makes them is quiet, settled. It gives them a reference point for what difficult actually is, that is grounded in real experience rather than imagination. When something hard happens later in their career, and hard things happen in naval aviation with some regularity, they have a baseline. They have been in the water upside down in the dark and made it out. Whatever is happening now can be worked. That is not a small thing. That is in fact one of the most significant things that this training produces, not just the physical skill of egress, but the experiential foundation for operating under pressure throughout the rest of a career. Let us talk about some specific communities for whom this training is particularly significant, starting with naval flight officers. The Naval Flight Officer, or NFO, is a commissioned officer who flies in the back seat of carrier-based aircraft and fills roles from weapons systems operator to electronic warfare officer to navigator. They are not pilots in the traditional sense, meaning they do not have their hands on the stick in the way the pilot does, but they are in the aircraft. They are in the cockpit. And if that aircraft goes into the water, they face the exact same physics and the exact same threat that the pilot faces. The NFO underwater egress training pipeline is equivalent to the pilot pipeline in its demands. The extra seat in the aircraft does not come with a safety advantage. It comes with the same requirement and the same standard. Search and rescue swimmers occupy a particularly interesting position relative to this training. The Navy Search and Rescue Swimmer, whose full designation is Aviation Rescue Swimmer, is trained to jump out of helicopters into open ocean and physically retrieve people who cannot rescue themselves. Their entire job is to operate in conditions that would be lethal for anyone without their training. They go through an intensive swimming and rescue pipeline that is one of the most demanding in the Navy, and as part of that pipeline, they go through underwater egress training, not just as potential victims of an aircraft accident, but as people who will be entering water under emergency conditions as a regular feature of their job. Their relationship to the training is therefore slightly different from a standard aviator's relationship to it. For the SAR swimmer, underwater egress training is preparation for one of the routine risks of doing what they do for a living. For the SAR swimmer, going into cold ocean water from a military aircraft is not an emergency scenario to be prepared for. It is a Tuesday. The MH-60 helicopter community, which encompasses both the SAR mission and the anti-submarine warfare mission, has particular institutional memory around underwater egress, because the MH-60 and its predecessors have been involved in water ditching incidents over the decades of their service. Not a large number, and naval aviation safety record is something the Navy has worked hard over generations to improve, but enough that the community understands in a personal and immediate way why the training exists. Senior pilots and crew chiefs in the helicopter community carry the stories of predecessors who made it out and predecessors who did not, and the difference between those outcomes has, more than once, been traceable directly to whether the person in the water did or did not execute the egress procedure correctly. Those stories travel through the community. They are told and retold not to frighten people, but to inform them, to give the training a weight and a context that makes the discomfort of the pool seem not just acceptable, but necessary. Now let us address the question that some people ask when they hear about training this difficult and this psychologically demanding. Is it worth it? Does the extreme stress of the training environment actually translate to better outcomes when the real thing happens? The answer, supported by decades of aviation safety data and the accounts of aircrew who survived real water emergencies, is unambiguous. Yes, the training works. There are documented cases of naval aircrew who survived water egress from crashed aircraft because the procedure was present in their muscle memory when their conscious mind was overwhelmed by the reality of the crash. There are cases of crew members who emerged from inverted, flooded aircraft that by any outside assessment should not have been survivable, and who did so because when the cockpit went into the water, something older than panic took over and ran the sequence that training had built. The training works because it does exactly what it is designed to do. It builds a version of the procedure that lives below the level at which panic can interfere with it. There are also cases where the outcome was different, where aircrew went into the water and did not come back out, where the investigation afterward found evidence that the procedure was not executed, or was executed incorrectly, or was not completed before the aircraft sank. These cases are studied with meticulous care, and the lessons from them are fed back into the training pipeline, because the Navy understands that every failure of the training to prevent a drowning is a failure that the training program has to account for and address. This is not an institution that looks away from its hard data. It is an institution that uses hard data to make training harder and more effective, and more precisely calibrated to the specific failure modes that real-world accidents reveal. The evolution of this training over the decades is itself a remarkable story. The original water egress training concepts were relatively simple, focused on basic breath hold duration and single-point egress from a straightforward cockpit mock-up. As naval aviation evolved and aircraft became more complex, as the seats in those aircraft multiplied and the cockpit configurations changed, the training evolved with it. As helicopters became dominant in naval aviation and the specific physics of helicopter water ditching became better understood, the HUET was developed and refined. As research on human performance under stress improved and the psychology of panic and procedural memory was better documented, the training was redesigned to incorporate those findings. The Navy underwater egress training program of today is not the program of 30 years ago, or 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago. It is a living curriculum that changes when the evidence says it should change, always in the direction of better preparing the people who go through it for what they will actually face. There is a population of people who went through this training years or decades ago who, if they went through the current version, would find it different from what they remember. Not softer, different. More precisely designed to address the specific failure modes that research and accident investigation have identified, more carefully calibrated to the specific physiological and psychological responses that the training is trying to address. Some of what has changed has been in the technology of the training devices themselves. Modern HUET equipment includes more realistic cabin configurations, better safety systems, and in some installations the ability to vary water temperature to add the element of cold water immersion stress. Cold water changes the physiological response significantly. The diving reflex is stronger, the cardiovascular impact is greater, and the interaction between cold and panic is something that warm water training does not fully replicate. For crews who operate in cold water environments, adding that element to the training adds a layer of realism that better prepares them for the actual conditions they might face. Some of what has changed is in the understanding of how to sequence the training for maximum effectiveness. Research on stress inoculation, the deliberate exposure to escalating levels of stress as a method of building stress tolerance, has influenced how the underwater egress training pipeline is structured. The incremental approach, starting with dry training, moving to clear water evolutions, progressively adding complexity and sensory challenge, is designed to build the neural pathways required for effective performance in a way that does not overwhelm the trainee's ability to learn before those pathways are established. If you throw someone directly into the hardest version of the training without preparation, you do not find out who is good under pressure. You find out who is good at random. The structured approach finds out who, with appropriate preparation, can be built into someone who performs correctly when it matters most. Let us talk about what happens after someone fails in evolution, because failure in this training does not automatically mean the end. For most evolutions, a trainee who fails to complete the procedure correctly is given additional instruction, additional dry training repetitions, and an opportunity to attempt the evolution again. The number of attempts varies by the specific program and the specific evolution, but the general approach is to treat failure as data about what additional training is needed, rather than as a final verdict on the trainee's capability. This is not universal. There are programs where the failure criteria are stricter and the recycling options are more limited. For community-specific pipelines, where the training is part of a larger qualification sequence, failure at the underwater egress component may result in remediation requirements that affect the overall timeline of the qualification. But the default disposition is toward learning, not toward elimination, because the goal is to produce trained aircrew, and a trainee who needed extra time to get there is not less capable than one who got there on the first attempt. There are, of course, candidates who do not make it through, regardless of the additional opportunities provided. People for whom the specific combination of underwater disorientation, breath hold pressure, and sensory deprivation represents a barrier that additional training does not overcome. These individuals are not failures in any meaningful sense of that word. They are people who discovered something important about where their limits are, information that is genuinely valuable to both them and to the Navy. An aircrew member who cannot reliably execute underwater egress is a risk to themselves and to whatever crew they are with if the aircraft goes into the water. Discovering that in a training pool is incomparably better than discovering it in the ocean. The system worked exactly as designed. It found the limit before the limit found the person in a situation where the margin for error was zero. What becomes of those individuals varies. Some leave aviation altogether and move to Navy ratings and communities, where the underwater egress requirement does not apply. Some pursue administrative roles within aviation that do not require flight status. Some take the information from their training experience and use it to pursue other paths within the Navy where their capabilities are a strong fit. The Navy is large enough, and the range of meaningful work within it broad enough, that a person who cannot complete underwater egress training is far from finished with a potentially significant naval career. They are simply redirected toward the parts of that career where the specific limitation identified in the pool does not put anyone at risk. Now let us zoom out and consider the broader context of what this training represents within the larger story of American naval power. The United States Navy operates in every ocean on the planet, around the clock, every day of the year. It does so with aircraft that fly over those oceans, helicopters that operate from ships in the middle of those oceans, and crews that accept as a routine feature of their professional lives the possibility that the machine they are riding could enter the water unexpectedly. The people who accept that reality and continue to show up for duty anyway are not reckless. They are trained to a standard that takes the most dangerous, predictable emergency in their operational environment and converts it from a likely fatality into a survivable event, provided the procedure is executed correctly. The training is what makes that conversion possible. Without it, the ocean wins almost every time. With it, people come home who would not otherwise come home. That is not an abstraction. That is what this training is for. The instructors who run the program, the facilities that house it, the funding that maintains it, the decades of research and development that went into designing it, all of it exists in service of a single outcome. The person in the inverted, flooded aircraft goes through the hatch and surfaces alive. That is it. That is the entire purpose. The Dunker exists for that. The Hewitt exists for that. The blackout goggles and the zero visibility and the burning lungs and the void exist for that, so that somewhere over the Pacific or the Atlantic or the Arabian Sea or the Mediterranean, if the aircraft goes in, the person inside of it comes out. There is one more dimension to this training that deserves to be spoken about directly, and that is what it means to go through it and come out the other side. Not just in terms of professional qualification, not just in terms of the skill it instills, but in terms of what it does to the person who survives it. People who complete the full progression of Navy underwater egress training, including the most demanding evolutions in zero visibility, with full disorientation, describe an experience that fundamentally changed their relationship to fear, not eliminated it. Fear is not eliminated by training. Fear is a physiological response to threat, and it will be present whenever threat is present. What changes is the relationship to it. The people who make it through this training understand, from direct personal experience rather than from philosophy or principle, that fear does not have to be in charge. It can be present and acknowledged and even respected for what it is, a signal from the body that something important is at stake, without being given the wheel. They know this because they have been in the water with the fear, and they have kept working. They have done the procedure anyway. They have followed the bubbles and found the surface and come back up, and they carry that knowledge with them for the rest of their lives. This is what the Navy is building when it builds this training. Not just egress skills, not just survival statistics. It is building the specific human quality that makes it possible to keep functioning when everything is wrong at once. The quality of being able to feel the full weight of a terrible situation and act correctly anyway. That quality is useful in water. It is also useful everywhere else. The naval aviator who made it through the Hewitt with blackout goggles on, who surfaced clean and composed and ready to debrief, who went back in again the next day and did it again to standard, carries something in their professional toolkit that no classroom course and no leadership seminar and no amount of conventional training can provide. They have been tested at the edge of what their nervous system can manage. They know where that edge is, and they know they can operate right up against it without going over. That is a rare thing. And the United States Navy spends considerable time and money and effort making sure that the people who fly its aircraft and crew its helicopters are people who have that quality in them, proven and verified, before they take their seats in the machine that might someday take them into the water. The training does not make guarantees. Nothing can guarantee survival. The ocean is too large and too indifferent and too unpredictable for guarantees. What the training makes is probability. It takes the probability of a clean egress in a real accident from something close to random to something considerably better than that. It makes the procedure available in conditions where nothing else is. It makes the difference between a statistic and a survivor. And for the people in those aircraft, for the families waiting at home, for the mission that depends on those crews returning from their flights, that difference is everything. If you learned something today, if you have a deeper respect for the